The herb box hit the floor of the sheriff's office with a crack that silenced every man in the room. Naomi Finley stood in the doorway, her dark hair loose from its pins, her dress torn at the shoulder where a man had grabbed her in the street not 20 minutes ago. Her green eyes were blazing with something so fierce and so cold at the same time that Warren Monroe, who had faced down outlaws and Apache war parties and one very determined grizzly bear in his 32 years, found himself taking half a step backward before he even realized he had moved. "You let him die," she said. Her voice did not shake. That was the most terrifying thing about it. "Elias Hodge came to my door at midnight with a wound in his side that I could have saved. I had the poultice. I had the yarrow and the clean linen. I had everything he needed. And your deputy dragged him out of my kitchen and told him to stop bothering the witch woman. And Elias Hodge died in the street at 4 in the morning because your man was afraid of my grandmother's herb box." Warren looked at the box on the floor. It was old, dark walnut, fitted with brass hinges gone green with age. It had cracked open when it fell, and inside he could see rows of small paper packets, clay jars sealed with wax, bundles of dried plants tied with twine. It smelled like something ancient and alive and impossibly certain of itself. He looked at Naomi Finley. He had been told she was trouble the day she arrived in Ridgeline, Kansas, in the spring of 1878. He had been told she was strange, that she kept odd hours and odd company, that she traded in remedies and tonics that no decent woman should know about. He had filed all of that away under the category of things small-minded people say about women who are better at things than they are. He had not been prepared for this. He had not been prepared for the fact that Elias Hodge, a man he had known for 6 years, a man who had ridden 3 cattle drives with him and once pulled him out of a river when his horse went down, was dead. He had not been prepared for the grief that hit him like a physical blow when he processed what she was saying. And he had not been prepared for the way she was looking at him, like he was the last barrier between her and justice, and like she had absolutely no doubt that she would get through him one way or another. "Where is Deputy Calver?" Warren said. "He is at the Silver Star drinking whiskey," Naomi said. "He has been there since 5 this morning. I imagine he is trying to forget what he did." Warren picked up the herb box. He set it carefully on his desk. He looked at the cracked hinge and felt something complicated move through his chest. "Sit down, Miss Finley," he said. "I do not want to sit down." "I know," he said. "Sit down anyway." She sat. He watched her fold her hands in her lap with a precision that told him she was using every bit of that unshakable will she'd come to this town with to keep herself together. He sat across from her. Outside Ridgeline, Kansas went about its Monday morning business, and somewhere in that town there was a man with a shovel and a grieving family, and Warren Monroe had a decision to make. He made it. He walked to the door of his office and called out to his other deputy, a young man named Hatch who was at least smart enough to be afraid of Warren, and told him to go to the Silver Star and bring Calver in. Not roughly. Just bring him in. Then he came back and sat down and looked at Naomi Finley and tried to understand how a woman he had spoken exactly 4 sentences to in 6 weeks had become the most important person in the room. "Let him tell you how she got here." Naomi Finley arrived in Ridgeline, Kansas on the 14th of March, 1878, on the stage from Wichita. She was 26 years old. She had a trunk, a carpet bag, and a battered walnut box with brass hinges that she carried herself and would not allow the driver to touch. She had come from Lexington, Missouri, and before that from a childhood split between her mother's house in St. Louis and her grandmother's farm outside of it, and it was on that farm where everything that mattered about Naomi Finley had been made. Her grandmother, Cecile Beaumont, had been the daughter of a woman who had come north from Louisiana in the 1830s, with a knowledge of plants and healing that went back further than anyone in Missouri could trace. Cecile had learned from her mother, and Naomi had learned from Cecile, and what she knew about the properties of plants, about infection and fever, and the way the human body fought and failed and sometimes won, was not folk superstition. It was empirical knowledge, built over generations of observation and trial, and the kind of meticulous record-keeping that her grandmother had maintained in 6 handwritten journals that Naomi could quote from memory. The herb box had been Cecil's. When the old woman died in the winter of 1876, she had pressed it into Naomi's hands and said, with the directness that had always been her defining quality, "You are better at this than I was. Do not waste it on people who already know how to stay alive." The frontier, Naomi had decided, was full of people who did not know how to stay alive. She had a modest inheritance from her grandmother and a letter of introduction to a woman named Dorothy Marsh, who ran the only boarding house in Ridgeline, and who had written to a cousin in Lexington looking for a healer, because the town's doctor had died of typhoid the previous autumn, and the nearest replacement was 2 days' ride away. The letter described what Naomi could do with restrained precision. What Dorothy Marsh had not quite conveyed to the town of Ridgeline was that Naomi Finley was going to arrive and immediately begin doing it with a confidence that some people found unsettling. She set up in the 2 back rooms of Dorothy's boarding house. She sent to Wichita for supplies. She planted a small garden in the corner of the yard, coaxing things into Kansas soil that had no business growing in Kansas soil, and within 3 weeks she was seeing patients. She was good. She was better than good. She diagnosed the Hendersons' youngest boy with a severe kidney infection that the boy's father had been attributing to bad character, and she treated it with uva ursi and forced fluids and complete rest, and the boy recovered fully. She identified a feverish woman on the edge of town as suffering from milk sickness caused by contaminated pasture, and moved the woman's cattle before anyone else in the family fell ill. She set bones and lanced infections and mixed cough syrups that actually worked, and she did all of it with the particular calm authority of someone who has studied deeply enough to stop being afraid of what they don't know. Warren Monroe noticed her the way he noticed everything in Ridgeline, systematically, at a slight remove, cataloging what she meant for the stability of his town. He was the sheriff, had been for 4 years, and before that he had been a cattle hand, and before that he had been a boy on a hardscrabble ranch in the Texas Panhandle, where his father had worked himself to a husk, and his mother had outlasted the land by sheer stubbornness alone. He had a quality that people sometimes mistook for coldness, which was actually extreme competence paired with a deep reluctance to speak, until he had something worth saying. He was 32, tall, broad through the shoulders in the way of a man who has spent his life doing physical work, with dark hair that wanted to curl if he let it get too long, and eyes the color of good whiskey and firelight, which is to say amber and warm and considerably more complicated than they first appeared. He had a scar along his jaw from a fight in Abilene that he did not particularly enjoy discussing. He had a reputation for fairness that he had earned slowly and protected carefully. He had spoken to Naomi Finley exactly 4 times before the morning. She walked into his office with her box and her fury and her grief. The first time was to welcome her to town, which he did to all new arrivals. The second was to tell her that her garden fence was technically encroaching on the boarding house property line, and that Dorothy would need to formalize it, which Naomi had accepted with a nod and dealt with by the following Tuesday. The third was at the Hendersons' party for their recovered son, where she had been standing alone by the punch bowl looking at the townspeople with an expression of calibrated patience, and he had said something about the weather, and she had said something dry and accurate about the weather, and then they had stood in companionable near silence for 3 minutes before a dispute broke out between 2 of the ranch hands and Warren had to go manage it. The fourth was when she had come to him to report that someone had thrown a rock through her garden fence, which he had investigated and attributed to the Garvey boys, who were 12 and 14 and generally awful, and he had handled it. He had noticed her each time with increasing intensity and had not done anything about it because he was the sheriff, and she was new to town, and noticing a woman with increasing intensity when you were responsible for keeping the peace was a conflict of interests that he took seriously. Then Elias Hodge died, and everything changed. Deputy Calver was a problem that Warren handled quietly and efficiently. He did not shout. He sat across from the man in his office with Naomi Finley sitting to his left, and he asked Calver to explain in sequence everything he had done and said on the night in question. Calver was 28 years old and had come from Ohio and was afraid of things he didn't understand, which was a longer list than it should have been. He had seen Elias Hodge going to Naomi's door in the middle of the night, and he had assumed things that he should not have assumed, and he had intervened in a way that was. Warren explained to him in a level voice that was somehow more frightening than shouting, a direct cause of a man's death. He stripped Calver of his badge. He would not press criminal charges because he was not certain the law allowed for it in exactly these circumstances, and he was not a man who charged people with things he couldn't prove. But Calver would not work for him again, and Warren told him so clearly and watched the man leave. When it was just the two of them, Warren said to Naomi, "I am sorry, that is not adequate, but it is true." Naomi looked at him for a long moment. "Keep the box safe," she said, which was not what he expected. "Someone has been trying to get into my rooms 3 times in the last 2 weeks. That was new information. That changed things." He felt the shift in himself, the professional attention sharpening into something else. "You should have told me. I was not sure you would take it seriously," she said, with a directness that he understood was not accusatory but simply honest. "I take everything seriously," he said, "particularly things that happen in my town." She studied him. He got the feeling she was applying the same careful empirical observation to him that she applied to a patient's symptoms. "I believe you," she said, and he felt an unreasonable amount of relief at that. The break-ins, when he investigated, turned out to be connected to something considerably larger and considerably more dangerous than he had anticipated, which was the nature of trouble in Ridgeline, which looked small and manageable until you pulled one thread and found it attached to everything else. The man behind it was named Denton Hale, which was not his real name, and he had arrived in Ridgeline 6 weeks before Naomi. He ran a patent medicine business out of a wagon parked at the edge of the main street, selling bottles of colored water and alcohol for prices that suggested they cured things that nothing could cure. He had a smooth way of talking and a handsome face that had not been handsome enough to cover his alarm when Naomi Finley arrived in town and started actually curing people. Warren did not know any of this yet. What he knew was that someone had wanted to get into Naomi's rooms, and that Naomi had a habit of knowing things that other people wanted kept quiet, and that 3 people in Ridgeline had died in the last 8 months of ailments that Naomi had, when Warren described them to her somewhat clinically, identified as possibly treatable. "Describe the symptoms again," she said. They were in her workroom, which was the smaller of the 2 rooms Dorothy had let to her, and it smelled like the herb box, but more so, like the whole world it represented. And Warren sat carefully in the one chair she had for patients and told her what he knew about Marcus Webb, who had died in September, and the Odele's woman, who had died in November, and old Fen Garrity, who had died in January. She stood at her workbench while he talked and sorted dried plants into small clay jars with a precision that he found genuinely hypnotic, and she asked clarifying questions that told him she had already been thinking about these deaths. "Webb had a sore that would not heal," she said. "On his left hand." "Yes, his wife mentioned it. The Odele's woman had difficulty breathing that started suddenly. Her husband said it came on in 3 days, and Garrity had seizures that started in his sleep. According to his daughter." Naomi was quiet for a moment. She opened one of her grandmother's journals, which she kept on a high shelf, and turned pages with the particular focus of someone who knows exactly what they're looking for. "These are not natural deaths," she said. Warren went very still. "Explain that to me." "The progression in all 3 cases is consistent with poisoning," she said. "Different poisons chosen for plausibility. Webb's sore is consistent with arsenic administered topically over time. The Odele's woman's respiratory failure is consistent with water hemlock, which grows wild along the creek. Garrity's nocturnal seizures are consistent with belladonna in small, repeated doses. She closed the journal. Someone in this town knows enough about plants to kill people with them and make it look like illness. The thing that happened in Warren Monroe's chest at that moment was complex. Part of it was horror, because there were 3 dead people in his town whose deaths had been ruled natural and were apparently not. Part of it was the particular cold clarity that came over him when a situation became serious, the settling into himself that made him good at his job. And part of it was something else entirely, because the woman standing across the workbench from him had just done something that no one else in his professional experience had done, which was to look at a set of facts he had considered solved and reveal them as something categorically different, with a knowledge that was so deep and so precise and so entirely her own that it stopped him completely. He had known she was capable. He had not known she was this capable. "You are sure?" he said. "No," she said, which surprised him. "I am certain enough to investigate further. I would need to examine the properties more closely, speak to the families, look at what was found in the houses. Then I would be sure." "I can help with that," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite read. "You believe me?" "Yes," he said without hesitation. Something shifted in her face then, not softening exactly, more like a door opening just slightly in a wall that she maintained with great care. "Most people do not," she said. "Most people are not sheriffs who have been looking at those 3 deaths and feeling like something was wrong and not being able to say why," he said. "You have just given me the why." They worked together for 10 days. This is the part that Naomi would later describe carefully as when things became complicated, and Warren would describe, with considerably less vocabulary about feelings, as when he understood what was happening to him. They visited the families. Naomi asked questions that were precise and unnerving in their specificity, about what food the deceased had eaten and where it came from, and whether there had been anyone new in the household in the months before the death. Warren managed the families, who ranged from suspicious to cooperative, and translated between Naomi's expert focus and the grieving bewilderment of people who were still not over their losses. He was good at this. He was patient and direct without being cold, and Naomi watched him work with a focus she usually reserved for her plants. He was not what she had expected him to be. She had expected the sheriff of a small Kansas town to be either a bully or a buffoon or some combination of both. Warren Monroe was neither. He was thoughtful and he was fair, and he had a quality of paying attention that she recognized because she had it herself, that complete presence in a situation that meant you missed very little. He also, she noticed, treated her opinions as opinions worth having, which was not universal among the men she dealt with professionally. He did not explain things to her that she already knew. He did not qualify her assessments with "for a woman" or "if you're right." He simply listened and asked questions that were good questions, and when she told him something, he incorporated it into his thinking without requiring her to convince him first. She found this deeply disorienting. What they found, over 10 days of careful work, was that all 3 victims had purchased patent medicine from Denton Hale's wagon in the weeks before they died. That 2 of them had been vocal about how his products hadn't worked for their ailments. That Hale had a practice of visiting people's homes to deliver orders, which meant he had been in all 3 houses. That a search of the creek bank near the Odelys property revealed a patch of water hemlock that had been recently disturbed. Warren arrested Denton Hale on a Thursday afternoon. Hale was smoother about it than Warren expected, not frightened, almost amused, and Warren did not like that. He locked Hale in the town jail and sent a wire to Wichita for a federal marshal, because a man who had possibly killed 3 people with deliberate and varied poisons was a federal matter, and also because Warren wanted backup from someone who could not be influenced by local politics. Naomi came to the jail that evening, not to see Hale. She came to Warren's office, which adjoined the jail, and set a tin cup of something on his desk that smelled like chamomile and something sharper. "You need to sleep," she said. "I need to think," he said. "You can do both. That is a mild preparation. It will not incapacitate you. He looked at the cup. He looked at her. I notice, he said, that you are the only person in this town who has been trying to poison the sheriff with any degree of good intention. She blinked. Then something happened that he had not seen before, which was Naomi Finley laughing. It was not a polite laugh. It was a genuine one, surprised out of her, and it changed her face entirely, and Warren Monroe sat back in his chair and looked at her and felt something so large and so obvious settle into place in his chest that he was briefly embarrassed it had taken him this long to recognize it. He drank the chamomile tea. It was good. She sat down across from him and they talked, not about the case. They talked about where they had come from, which was a conversation that happened in frontier towns between people who had chosen this life, and were in some quiet agreement that the choosing had meant something. She told him about her grandmother's farm, about learning to identify plants before she could read, about Cecil's journals, and the way the old woman had insisted that knowledge was not folk magic. It was science, and that Naomi should not let anyone tell her different. She told him about the decision to come west, which had been clear to her in a way that she couldn't entirely explain but had trusted. He told her about Texas, about the cattle work, about coming north and learning the law and finding that it fit him in the way that things fit you when you are doing what you are supposed to do. He told her about Ridgeline, which he had come to 6 years ago and stayed in because it needed what he could provide, which was order imposed by someone who actually believed in it. You could have gone to a bigger town, she said. Bigger towns have more people competing to maintain order, he said. Ridgeline needed one person. I was available. She was quiet for a moment. That is a very lonely answer, she said. It was a more accurate observation than he had received from most people about most things. Yes, he said, it has been. He said it simply, without self-pity, and she heard the truth in it and did not look away from it, which he appreciated more than he had words for. The federal marshal arrived from Wichita 5 days later. His name was Aldridge. He was 40-something and competent and immediately interested in Naomi's analysis, which she presented to him in his sheriff's office with her grandmother's journals open on Warren's desk, and a clarity that made Aldridge sit forward in his chair. You can testify to this, Aldridge said. I can, Naomi said. I can demonstrate the symptoms through documented case records and botanical literature and my own direct observation. The evidence is circumstantial in part, but the pattern is not. Aldridge looked at Warren. Where did she come from? Missouri, Warren said, and kept his face very neutral. The trial was scheduled for Wichita 4 weeks out. In the meantime, Hale sat in Warren's jail and got progressively less amused and progressively more afraid, which Warren found appropriate. The man had a lawyer who came from Topeka and was expensive and good, and Warren did not let himself worry about this because worrying about things outside his control was not a habit he cultivated. What he did let himself do in those 4 weeks was pursue something he had wanted to pursue since the Thursday evening when Naomi Finley laughed in his office. He started by finding reasons to be where she was, which he recognized as juvenile, and did anyway because the alternatives were either full honesty, which he was building toward, or complete avoidance, which was not possible in a town the size of Ridgeline. He stopped by the boarding house on professional pretexts that became increasingly transparent. He tasted the chamomile tea she brought him, and noticed she had changed the ratio of something since the first batch. He helped her repair the garden fence properly, which she did not need help with but accepted with a look that told him she understood what he was actually doing and had decided to let him do it. He was not subtle. He was never subtle. His mother had always said he communicated like a man carrying a 2x4 in a narrow hallway, and he had never disputed it. But there was something about Naomi that made him want to get it right, which slowed him down. The thing that tipped it was the Martinson boy. The Martinson family ran sheep 2 miles outside of town, which put them at odds philosophically with most of the cattle ranchers in the area. And Warren had spent considerable energy over 4 years ensuring that this philosophical disagreement did not become a violent one. Thomas Martinson was 8 years old and had been sick for 2 weeks with something that his parents called a summer fever, and that Naomi, when called out to the farm in the second week of June, identified immediately as a severe case of scarlet fever. Warren rode out with her because the road between Ridgeline and the Martinson farm ran through 2 miles of open country, and Hale was in jail, but Hale had friends who were not, and Warren was not taking chances. They rode side by side in the long summer light, and he watched her dismount at the farm gate and go into the house with her box and her certainty, and he stayed outside with the horses and felt the peculiar helplessness of a man who is very good at most things and completely useless at this particular thing, which was medicine. She was inside for 2 hours. When she came out, her sleeves were rolled to the elbow and her hair was down again, and that way it got when she was working hard, the pins coming loose from the knot, and she had that expression on her face that he had come to recognize as the particular focus she brought to serious cases. "He is very ill," she said, "but I believe he will recover with proper treatment. I need to come back every day for a week, and the other children need to be watched." "What do you need?" he said. She looked at him with that slight surprise he still saw sometimes when he responded to her with immediate practicality instead of doubt. "A way to get here safely every day," she said, "and clean linen. And if anyone can bring ice from the ice house in town, that would help considerably." He arranged all of it by the next morning. He drove her out himself every day for a week, and on the 4th day Thomas Martinson's fever broke in the early afternoon, and the boy opened his eyes and asked for his mother, and Naomi sat back in her chair beside the bed and closed her eyes for a moment in a way that he saw from the doorway, and that moved him more than he could account for. On the drive back on the 5th day, she fell asleep against his shoulder. It was a testament to how tired she was that she did it, because she was not a woman who let her guard down carelessly. And it was a testament to something else entirely, that Warren Monroe drove 4 miles of Kansas road without moving a muscle, barely breathing, doing nothing that would disturb her rest, which was maybe the most deliberately careful thing he had ever done. She woke up when they reached the edge of town, sat up straight, and said nothing about it. Neither did he. He waited 2 more days because he was, at core, a patient man. Then he knocked on the door of her workroom on a Sunday evening when the boarding house was quiet and Dorothy Marsh was at church social, and there was no reason for him to be there except the reason he was there. She opened the door and looked at him without surprise, which told him she had been expecting something, if not exactly this. "Warren," she said, and his name in her mouth was something he had been noticing for weeks. "I would like to have a conversation," he said. "That is not about the case or the town or any medical matter." "All right," she said, and stepped back to let him in. He sat in the patient chair. She stood at her workbench and did not pretend to sort plants. "I want to say something that is direct and possibly inconvenient," he said, "and then I want you to tell me honestly what you think." "That is the only kind of conversation I have," she said. He almost smiled. "I have been thinking about you," he said, with a consistency that has started to interfere with my work, which is unusual. "I think you are remarkable. I think the way you think is remarkable. I think what you do is remarkable, and I think you do not hear that clearly or often enough. And I think that if you were willing to let me, I would like to know you better, in a specific way." Naomi Finley looked at him. She had green eyes that were always thinking, always assessing, and he let her assess him because he had nothing to hide and no desire to hide it. "You are not afraid of me," she said, and it was half statement and half question. "No," he said. "I am occasionally afraid for you, which is different. Last week when you were driving out to the Martinsons, before I knew about it, I was afraid for you. That is self-interested." She was quiet for a moment. Outside, the summer evening was settling over Ridgeline, and somewhere a dog was barking at something that was probably nothing. "I came here," she said carefully, "because I needed to be somewhere that needed what I know. I did not come here looking for a person." "I know that," he said. I am not asking you to have come here looking for one. I am asking you what you want now that you are here." It was the right question. He saw it land. "You listened to me," she said. "Not politely, actually." "Yes," he said. "You have never once told me that what I know is interesting for someone of my position," she said, and the word position carried a weight he understood. "No," he said. "It is interesting for a person. The best I have encountered." She looked at him for a long time. He did not fill the silence. "I would like to know you better also," she said, finally, with a precision that made him feel like the words had been carefully selected from a larger number of available words, and were therefore more meaningful than a more casual declaration would have been. In the same specific way, Warren Monroe was not a man who smiled easily or often, but he smiled then, and it was the kind of smile that came from somewhere deeper than the surface and changed his face entirely. Naomi looked at it and felt something warm and alarming happen in her chest, which she catalogued with the same careful attention she brought to everything, and recognized immediately as the beginning of something she was not going to be able to manage with herbal preparation. The trial in Wichita happened in late July. Warren escorted Naomi there, 2 days' ride, which they made with Dorothy Marsh as a chaperone because Warren respected propriety even when he disagreed with its specific applications. Dorothy was a practical woman who had outlived 2 husbands and had opinions about everything and was, Naomi had discovered, more perceptive than her comfortable exterior suggested. On the first evening of the journey, when they stopped at a way station and Dorothy had gone to bed with the decisive efficiency of a woman who believes sleep is a strategic resource, Warren and Naomi sat outside by a small fire and talked about everything and nothing for 2 hours. He told her about the man he had been before he was the sheriff. It was not a comfortable story. He had been in a fight in Abilene that had cost him more than the scar on his jaw. He had killed a man, in that fight, in circumstances that were legally defensible and morally complicated, and it had taken him years to find peace with it. The law was what he had found, not as absolution but as discipline, as a structure in which the impulse to protect was channeled into something sustainable. She listened without judgment, which was not the same as listening without response. She asked him what the man had been doing that precipitated the fight, and when he told her, she said, "Then you protected someone who could not protect themselves. That is not a comfortable thing to carry, but it is not a wrong thing to have done." He looked at her in the firelight. "You have a way of being certain about things," he said, and it was not a criticism. "I have a way of following evidence to its conclusion," she said. "The evidence of your character is not ambiguous." He reached across the space between them and took her hand. It was not an impulsive gesture, which was why it meant what it meant. She looked down at their hands and then up at him and did not pull away. "I am not a simple situation," she said quietly. "What I do in this time and this place will always be something people find unsettling. The work will always come first. I need you to understand that before anything else." "The work coming first is not a problem," he said. "The work is part of why I am sitting here." She considered this. "That is a more complete answer than I expected. I told you I think carefully before I speak." "You did tell me that," she said, and the warmth in her voice was something new, something she was still calibrating, and he felt the privilege of being allowed to watch her figure out how to let someone in. Denton Hale was convicted. Naomi's testimony was, by all accounts including Aldridge's professionally understated assessment, exceptional. She stood before the court and laid out the botanical evidence with the clarity and confidence of someone who had spent her whole life being certain of exactly this thing. And she withstood the cross-examination from Hale's Topeka lawyer with a patience that was, Warren observed from his seat, not really patience at all but the absolute stillness of someone who knows they are right and is simply waiting for the other person to figure it out. The jury was out for 3 hours and came back with a unanimous verdict. Hale would hang in the fall. Warren watched Naomi in the courthouse afterward, surrounded by Aldridge and several of the jurors who wanted to talk to her, and he stood to the side and felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, which was uncomplicated pride in another person. Not pride in something he had done. Pride in watching something excellent be exactly what it was. She found him after in the courthouse yard. Dorothy was talking to someone she knew from her Wichita days, which gave them a minute. "You were extraordinary in there," he said. "I was accurate," she said, which was her version of accepting a compliment. "Those are not mutually exclusive," he said. "Are you all right?" She considered the question seriously, which he appreciated because she always considered questions seriously. "I am tired," she said, "and I am glad it is done, and I want to go home." He noted the word home and what it meant. "We leave in the morning," he said. On the second day of the ride back in the afternoon, when Dorothy had dozed off in her saddle in the comfortable way of an experienced rider, and the Kansas plain stretched out golden and enormous around them, Warren said, "I want to ask you something." Naomi looked at him. "You have been composing it for 2 hours," she said. "I have been composing it for about 3 weeks," he said. "I wanted to wait until the trial was over, until you were not under any professional pressure. I wanted to ask you when things were settled." "Things are rarely settled on the frontier," she said, and he couldn't tell if it was a warning or a fact. "I know," he said. "I mean settled enough. I want to court you properly, Naomi, with intention. I want to be clear about my intention." She was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. The horses moved through the grass and the sky was enormous above them. "Your intention," she said. "To marry you," he said. "Eventually, if you find over time that you want that. I am not asking you now. I am telling you what I am working toward so you have the full picture and can make a decision about whether this is worth your time." Naomi Finley looked out at the Kansas horizon and then back at Warren Monroe, and she said, "You are a very straightforward man." "I have been told that is a liability," he said. "Not by me," she said. "Yes, court me properly. I would like that." Dorothy Marsh was not asleep. She smiled at her saddle horn and said nothing, which was the most tactful thing she had done in years. The autumn of 1878 was one of the finest that Ridgeline, Kansas had seen in recent memory, or at least that was what the older residents said, and Warren Monroe privately agreed, though his criteria for this assessment had less to do with rainfall and harvest yields than with other things. He and Naomi walked in the evenings when her work allowed it, which was not every evening but most. They walked along the main street first, because that was proper and visible, and then as the weeks went on they walked further, out to the edge of town where the plain began and the sky was enormous, and they talked with the ease of people who have discovered that talking to each other is one of the better things they can do with time. He told her about his years on the cattle trail, which were full of the kind of stories that were better with some distance on them. She told him about her mother, who was still in St. Louis and wrote letters that were loving and baffled in equal measure. She told him about the years in Lexington between her grandmother's death and her departure for the frontier, which had been years of restlessness and purpose gathering itself. He brought her things, not gifts exactly, or not only gifts. He brought her specimens he found in his work, plants he thought she might not have seen, interesting rocks, once a piece of mica he'd found along the creek that caught the light in a way that seemed relevant to someone who paid attention to light. She brought him food, which was not her primary skill area but which she applied herself to with the same seriousness she brought to everything, with results that were increasingly successful as autumn went on. He met her mother in October, when Clara Finley arrived on the stage from Wichita on a visit that Naomi had described in advance as well-intentioned and potentially exhausting. Clara was 52, small and bright-eyed and considerably more perceptive than her slightly fluttery manner suggested. She assessed Warren Monroe in the first 5 minutes with the efficiency of a woman who has been worrying about her daughter for a specific reason and is now checking whether that reason remains valid. By the end of the first evening, she had apparently decided something, because she stopped assessing him and started simply talking to him, which he understood as a favorable outcome. Clara said to Naomi, in the way of mothers who believe they are being quiet, "He listens to you." "Yes," Naomi said. "That is not nothing," Clara said. "I know," Naomi said, and Clara looked at her daughter's face and pressed her lips together in the expression of a woman trying not to cry in a way that would embarrass everyone. It was in the second week of November, on an evening that had turned cold and clear with the particular winter sharpness of the plains, that Warren Monroe brought up marriage again. Not circuitously. He was not a circuitous man. They were in the boarding-house parlor, which Dorothy let them use in the evenings because she was a romantic at core despite all evidence she would offer to the contrary. A fire was going. Naomi was reading one of her grandmother's journals, annotating something in the margins in her precise small handwriting. Warren was reading nothing because he had been thinking for too long to focus. He said, "I have been thinking about the practical arrangements." She looked up from the journal. "Of what?" "Of a house," he said. "If you were willing, I would build you a house with a workroom that was purpose-built. Not the two back rooms of Dorothy's boarding house. A proper room with good light and storage for the box and the plants and everything else. A garden that was large enough." Naomi set down the journal. She looked at him steadily. "I have some money saved," he continued. "Not a great deal, but enough for a sound structure. I would do the work myself where I could. Jim Larkspur has been asking for work and he's a good carpenter." "You have been planning this," she said. "I have been thinking about it," he said, which was his version of the same thing. She was quiet for a moment. "Warren," she said, and the way she said his name had changed over the months, had become something warm and direct and entirely certain. "Are you asking me to marry you?" "Yes," he said. "I am asking. You do not have to decide tonight." "I do not need until tomorrow," she said. "Yes." He looked at her. "Yes," he confirmed because he wanted to be sure he had heard correctly and he was not too proud to verify important information. "Yes, I will marry you," she said, with the particular clarity she used when she wanted no room for misinterpretation. "I want the workroom with good light. And the garden. And I want to keep working." "Of course," he said, as if this had never been in question, which for him it never had been. She crossed the parlor and sat beside him on the settee, and he put his arm around her and she rested against his side, and they sat like that in the firelight for a long time, which was the most comfortable and complete that either of them had felt in longer than they cared to remember. They were married in December, 2 weeks before Christmas, in the church at the end of Main Street by a minister named Aldred who was brief and heartfelt. Dorothy Marsh cried. Clara Finley, who had come back for the wedding, cried more thoroughly. Jim Larkspur, who was there because Warren had asked him, and he was the closest thing Warren had to a friend in Ridgeline that wasn't Naomi, did not cry but stood very straight and clapped harder than anyone when the minister pronounced them. The ring was simple, a plain gold band that Warren had ordered from a jeweler in Wichita, and that fit Naomi's hand as though it had been made specifically for her, which it had been, because Warren had measured with a string one evening in a way that he had thought was subtle, and she had thought was extremely obvious, and neither of them had mentioned at the time. The house went up through the winter, because Warren worked on it every day he wasn't needed as sheriff, and in December that was most days. It was on the south edge of town, a sound frame structure with a covered porch and 4 rooms, and a 5th room off the back that was Naomi's workroom, with windows on 2 walls for the light and shelves that went floor to ceiling, and a deep counter that Warren built himself to her precise specifications. She moved into it in February, when the last of the work was done, and she stood in the workroom in the thin winter light and opened her grandmother's herb box and placed it on the counter and stood back and looked at it there and felt something settle in her that had been shifting since the day Cecil Beaumont had pressed the box into her hands. Warren stood in the doorway behind her. He had learned to read her silences, and this one was not sad. "Good," he said. She turned and looked at him with the full warmth of her face, which she had been slowly learning to let him see unguarded. "Good," she said. He stepped into the room and stood beside her and looked at the box on the counter, its old brass hinges green with age, the small crack in the side from the morning she had dropped it in his office, which he had repaired with a careful application of wood glue and a clamp and which had held perfectly. He put his hand on the box and looked at it the way he looked at things he respected. "Essential," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "The box," he said. "You, essential, both of you, to this town." He paused in the way he always paused when he was being precise. To me. Naomi Finley Monroe looked at her husband in the morning light of the workroom she had been given because he understood what she was, and felt the kind of love that is built rather than fallen into, that is chosen every day with clear eyes and full information, that is stronger for knowing exactly what it is. "You are extremely careful with words," she said. "I told you that at the beginning," he said. "You did," she said. And she kissed him in the herb-scented morning of her workroom, which was in a house she had not known she was building toward, in a town she had come to with a box and a will and no particular expectation of finding Warren Monroe. Spring came, as it does, with the particular ferocity of Kansas springs that are beautiful and violent by turns. Naomi's garden woke up with the season and expanded, because she had spent the winter planning it with the same methodology she brought to everything, and by April it was the most productive kitchen and medicinal garden in Ridgeline. People came to her house now. The workroom door was open most mornings, and through it came the usual procession of ailments and concerns and questions, and Naomi handled all of them with the combination of knowledge and precision, and increasingly, a patience with the anxious and the uncertain that was perhaps the quality she had had to grow into, because patience had never come as naturally to her as knowledge. Warren watched this from the periphery of her work and felt uncomplicated admiration. He also felt useful, which mattered to him. He was the law and she was the medicine, and between them they covered most of what a town needed to get through the ordinary and extraordinary challenges of frontier life, and he liked the symmetry of this in a way he did not examine too closely in case examining it made it feel smaller. Thomas Martinson, the boy they had treated in the summer, brought her a drawing he had made in school. It was of a woman with dark hair and a box. Even at 8 years old he had captured something of her in the way she stood, the particular uprightness of it. Naomi pinned it to the wall of her workroom where she could see it. In May, Naomi told Warren she believed she was expecting. She told him in the workroom because that was where she was most herself, in the place that was built for her, and she told him with the directness she brought to important information. She described the symptoms. She described the timeline. She told him she was approximately 8 weeks along and that the pregnancy appeared healthy. Warren sat down on the stool she kept for patients because his legs made the decision before he did. He looked at her with something on his face that she had not seen there before, and that she would later describe to Dorothy as the face of a man who has just understood something enormous and has not yet decided how to hold it. "Are you well?" he said, and the question had more layers in it than 4 words usually carried. "Very well," she said. "Better than I expected, in fact. I have been monitoring carefully." "I know you have," he said, and then he stood up and crossed to her and put both hands on her face and kissed her forehead with a gentleness that was so deliberate it made her eyes sting, and she let it because this was Warren, who loved her with his whole straightforward heart, and she loved him with hers. The pregnancy was as healthy as she had assessed it would be. Naomi was rigorous about her own health with the same rigor she brought to her patients, perhaps more so, and she continued working through the summer because stopping was not something she was willing to do, and because there was no medical reason for it. Warren accepted this with a period of exactly 1 week of quiet concern, during which he researched the question from every angle available to him, and concluded that Naomi's own assessment was more reliable than anything he could bring to bear from outside it. He said this to her. She said, "I know," with a warmth that told him the week of quiet concern had been noticed and appreciated regardless. Their son was born in December, exactly 1 year after their wedding. Warren delivered him with Naomi's guidance, because there was no doctor in Ridgeline, and Dorothy Marsh, who served as midwife, developed a sudden anxious cold, and it was Warren who was there and Naomi who talked him through it with the magnificent composure of a woman who has spent years teaching scared people to do difficult things correctly. He weighed 7 pounds and had Naomi's green eyes and Warren's dark hair, and he came into the world with the decisive energy of a person who has made up his mind about being here, which both of his parents found appropriate. They named him Cecil in the middle, for Naomi's grandmother. His first name was Thomas, because the Martinson boy had asked with 8-year-old earnestness if he could be honored, and Naomi had found this so touching she had said yes before she quite knew she was saying it. Thomas Cecil Monroe, born December 1879, in the house on the south side of Ridgeline, Kansas. Warren held him that first evening in the parlor, this tiny and specific person, and felt something so large it had no name he knew. Naomi watched from the settee where she was resting, propped on pillows, her hair loose, her face tired and luminous and more open than he had ever seen it. And she thought about all the places the road had been in her life and all the turnings that had brought her to this one. And she was grateful with a depth that she could not have prepared for. She thought about Cecil, who had given her the box and the knowledge and the instruction not to waste either one. And she thought that her grandmother would have approved of this room, this man, this child, with the particular satisfaction of someone whose faith in a person had been vindicated completely. "He looks very certain of himself already," Warren said, still looking at the boy. "He comes by it," Naomi said. Warren looked at her over the baby's head with the amber warmth of his eyes and the smile that she still found, over a year of knowing him, to be one of the best things she had ever seen. "He does," he said. In the spring of 1880, a new doctor arrived in Ridgeline. His name was Prescott. He was freshly trained from a medical college in Cincinnati. He was 24 years old, and he arrived with a certificate and a leather bag, and a set of assumptions about medical authority that became, very quickly, complicated by the reality of Naomi Monroe. He was not bad. He was simply young and theoretical in a way that practice had not yet corrected. And for the first month he and Naomi navigated a professional relationship that Warren watched with the careful attention of a man who has managed territorial disputes before and recognizes one in its early stages. The thing that resolved it was a child with a very high fever that Prescott was treating with standard methods that were not working. Naomi came to see the child at the mother's request, assessed the situation with her grandmother's journals and her own decade of experience, and identified a severe bacterial infection that required aggressive treatment with a specific combination of willow bark preparation and external application of cooling compress in a particular alternating rhythm. She explained this to Prescott with the directness and lack of condescension of someone who is genuinely interested in solving the problem and not in the status question. Prescott was bright enough to listen. The child recovered. After that, Prescott came to her regularly with cases he was uncertain about, and she consulted with him when she had patients who needed something she could not provide. It was not a friendship exactly, but it was a professional respect that grew into something that functioned well, and Ridgeline was better for having both of them. Warren observed this with satisfaction. He observed most things in Ridgeline with satisfaction because they were going well, but the fact of Naomi and her work going well was a particular variety of satisfaction that lived in a different place than the professional kind. He was proud of her. He told her so, regularly, in the direct way he had with important things, and she received it in the way she received compliments from him now, which was with openness, and occasionally with the dry humor that she kept primarily for him. Thomas was walking by his first birthday, which both parents found excessively symbolic and did not say aloud because they were not people who said excessively symbolic things. And by 18 months, he was following Naomi around the workroom with the purposeful waddle of a toddler who has decided that whatever this person is doing is the most important thing happening, and he should be part of it. He reached for the herb box with both hands, which was either instinct or coincidence, and was, either way, the thing that made Naomi sit down on the workroom floor and take her son in her lap and hold him with a completeness that Warren, passing the doorway, saw and stopped for and said nothing about, because some moments are best received in silence. He had a second child on the way. Naomi had told him in February, with the same direct assessment of symptoms and timeline, and this time he did not sit down on the stool but instead picked her up, which startled her considerably, and held her in the middle of the workroom with his face in her hair, and she put her arms around his neck and let herself be held, which she was better at now than she had been in the beginning. "You are going to need a bigger garden," he said. She laughed against his shoulder. "The garden is adequate. The house, however, I will build an addition," he said. "Jim Larkspur owes me a favor." "Jim Larkspur always owes you a favor," she said. "I managed that carefully," he said, and she could hear the smile in it. The second child was a girl, born in November 1881, and they named her Cecile as the first name, which was a conversation they had and a decision Naomi made with Warren's full support. Cecile Monroe arrived with a personality that was immediately apparent even at newborn size, which was to say determined and opinionated and impatient with anything that was not what she wanted. And Warren looked at his daughter's furious infant face and said to Naomi, with complete sincerity, "She is going to be extraordinary." "Yes," Naomi said, "she absolutely is." The winters in Kansas were long and the summers were hard, and the work of frontier life was unrelenting in its demands. But the house on the south side of Ridgeline was a warm place. It was warm because of the fire that Warren built with care, and because of the food that was, by 1882, actually very good because Naomi had applied herself to learning to cook with the same systematic rigor she applied to everything. It was warm because of Thomas, who was 3 and ferociously verbal and had opinions about everything, including the correct way to arrange dried plants, which was wrong but held with conviction. It was warm because of Cecile, who at 1 year old had established herself as someone who would be held when she wanted to be held and set down when she wanted to be set down, and fed on a schedule that she had determined herself and was not negotiable. It was warm mostly because of what it contained, which was a marriage between two people who had come to the frontier, carrying what they needed most and had found, in the finding of each other, that what they needed had expanded to include things they had not known they were missing. Warren Monroe sat on his porch on a September evening in 1882 in the hour after supper when the children were in bed, and the town was settling and Naomi was beside him in the second chair he had built for exactly this purpose, and the plain stretched out gold and enormous before them in the last of the light, and he thought about the road from Texas and the years on the cattle trail, and the fight in Abilene and the scar on his jaw, and about the day the stage had pulled into Ridgeline, and a woman had stepped down with a carpet bag and a battered walnut box, and he had noted her arrival in the way he noted all arrivals, which was to say professionally and at a slight remove. He had not known. He had been completely wrong about what was coming. He was glad of it, of the particular gladness of a man who has received more than he knew he was going to get. Naomi was reading something, because she was always reading something, and the evening light caught her profile and the loose strand of hair she had not bothered to pin back, and she reached out without looking up from her page and put her hand on his arm in the easy, unthinking way of a person who knows exactly where someone is. He put his hand over hers. "Warren," she said, still reading. "Yes," he said. "The Hendersons' youngest has had a cough for 2 weeks. She mentioned it to Dorothy today. I am going to see him tomorrow." "No," he said. "You will need the morning." "Yes." She turned a page. "Thank you." He looked at her hand under his, at the plain gold band on her finger, at the herb-stained edge of her fingernails that was always there, the mark of her work on her. At the woman who had come to this place with 2 things she was certain of, and had made both of them essential to a town that had needed them, to a man who had thought he was complete and had been shown the specific shape of what he was missing. "Naomi," he said. She looked up from the book. "I love you," he said, which he said regularly and without ceremony because it was true and he was a man who said true things. Her green eyes in the evening light were warm and clear and entirely present. "I love you," she said, with the same precision she brought to everything she meant, which meant she meant it completely. She turned back to her book and her hand stayed on his arm, and the Kansas plain went on forever in the golden light, and the herb box sat on its shelf in the workroom behind them, its brass hinges green with age, its small crack repaired and holding, containing everything that had started this and everything that had grown from it, essential and known, and exactly where it was supposed to be. There were more evenings after that one. There were more patients, more cases, more winters and springs, and the gradual accumulation of a life lived with intention and care. Prescott, the young doctor, grew into a good physician and married a woman from Wichita who was formidable in her own right and became part of the fabric of Ridgeline. Dorothy Marsh lived to be 78 and contentious to the last, and was beloved by the town that found her exhausting. Clara Finley came to visit every spring and stayed a little longer each year, and eventually, in 1884, simply stayed, occupying a room in the house on the south side of town, with the particular satisfaction of a woman who has finally been convinced that her daughter has everything she needs. Thomas Monroe, at 5, declared with the absolute confidence of his parents that he would be a healer, and at 10 revised this to say he would be the healer and the law both, which his parents did not discourage. Cecile Monroe was at every age the most determined person in any room she entered, which was frequently a room she had entered specifically to make a point that needed making, and both her parents watched her with the appreciation of people who know the value of exactly this quality. The herb box was still in the workroom in 1885, when Naomi's third child was born, another boy they named James after Warren's father, who had worked himself to dust on a Texas ranch, but who had given his son the stubbornness to keep going, which was worth honoring. James Monroe arrived with his mother's green eyes and his father's particular stillness and a disposition that was, from the very beginning, quietly determined, which was perhaps the best combination of both of them. Warren held James in the evening light as he had held Thomas and Cecile, and looked at this third specific person they had made, and felt the depth of it with the same completeness he had felt each time, because it did not become less each time. It became more. Naomi recovered from James's birth with the efficiency she brought to everything and was back in her workroom in 2 weeks, which both pleased and concerned Warren in exactly equal measure, and which he expressed by building a chair in the workroom that was more comfortable than the patient's stool, so she could work sitting down when she needed to rest. She used the chair. She did not say it was because he had made it for that reason. He did not say it either. They understood each other. The frontier of 1885 was not the frontier of 1878. The railroad had come closer. The cattle drives were changing. There were more people and more laws and more of the machinery of civilization arriving in places that had previously been governed by weather and individual character. Ridgeline was not the raw, exposed thing it had been when Naomi stepped off the stage with her box and her will. It had grown into itself, had schools and a bank and a newspaper that was small but opinionated, and had once published a piece about Naomi's botanical methods that she had found partly flattering and partly wrong, which she had corrected in a letter to the editor of such precision that the editor had printed it in full. Warren was still the sheriff. He had been asked about other positions, had been mentioned for a county role that would have meant more authority and more money and a move to Wichita. He had considered it seriously, which was how he considered everything, and declined, which was not what Naomi had expected. "You should have taken it," she said. "The county role would have been right for you." "It would have been right for certain parts of me," he said. "Ridgeline is right for all of me." She looked at him. "You are staying because of us," she said. "The children and me. I am staying because this is where we are," he said, "which means this is where I want to be. Those are not different things." She thought about this with the care she brought to his words, which she had learned to do because his words were chosen and therefore worth examining. "No," she said finally, "I suppose they are not." He was 50 when he retired as sheriff, in 1896, and the town held a dinner for him that was better attended than any event in Ridgeline's recent memory, and people said things about him that were true, and that he received with the particular discomfort of a man who is grateful and not used to receiving things. Naomi sat beside him at the head table and kept her hand on his arm through the speeches, and he was grateful for that anchor the way he was grateful for everything about her, which was completely. He did not stop working, because he was not built for not working, but his work became different. He helped Thomas, who had taken over as deputy and was working toward the sheriff's position himself, with the particular usefulness of someone who knows a town so well that his knowledge is its own kind of law. He spent more time in Naomi's workroom, which had expanded twice over the years, and was now a serious facility that drew patients from as far as 2 counties away. He had learned enough from her over the years to be genuinely useful in there, not as a healer, which was not his skill, but as the person who prepared and organized and managed the flow of people in ways that let her focus on the work itself. She told him once, in the workroom in the evening, that she had not expected him to become part of it. "I have always been part of it," he said. "I just know more herb names now." She laughed at that, the genuine surprised laugh that she still had, that still changed her face entirely, and he still felt, at 52 years old, the same thing he had felt the first time he heard it, which was the particular joy of being the cause of something that good. The herb box was on the shelf where it had always been. The brass hinges were darker now, and the crack on the side had never reopened, and inside it the small paper packets and clay jars and bundles of twine had changed over the years as Naomi's knowledge had grown and her supplies had expanded, but the box itself was unchanged. It was the oldest thing in the house and the most traveled, having come from Louisiana in the hands of a woman whose name Naomi knew but whose face she had never seen, through Cecil Beaumont's hands and then her own, from St. Louis to Lexington to the frontier of Kansas, to this workroom that had been built for it. Thomas Monroe was 20 by the time his mother began teaching him formally, which is to say that she began writing down for him what she had been teaching him informally for years, turning her knowledge into something transmissible. He sat at the counter in the workroom and took notes with the seriousness of a young man who understands he is being given something rare, and Naomi taught him with the patience she had grown into and the rigor she had always had, and the knowledge that her grandmother had given her moved into another pair of hands. Cecil Monroe, 14 and already formidable, watched this and said to her mother, with her characteristic directness, "I want to learn too." "I know," Naomi said. "You have been learning since you could walk. Sit down." She sat them both at the counter, her son and her daughter, and opened the first of Cecil Beaumont's 6 journals and began at the beginning. Warren Monroe stood in the doorway of the workroom that had been built to hold this, and looked at his wife teaching their children from her grandmother's knowledge, the old box on the shelf behind her, the evening light coming through the 2 windows he had put there for exactly this purpose, and he thought about what it meant to be essential to something, not indispensable, which implies fragility, but essential, which implies that you are part of what a thing fundamentally is. She had come to this frontier with her grandmother's herb box and her own unshakable will. He had been the one who called both essential, and he had been right, and he had known it in the moment he said it, and he had never stopped knowing it through all the years since. Naomi looked up from the journal and found him in the doorway. Her green eyes in the evening light were the same as they had always been, clear and thinking and entirely present, and the years were in them now in the way of a person who has spent their life paying attention, which does something different to a face than anything else. She looked at him the way she had been looking at him for 17 years, which was with her whole full knowing attention, and she smiled at him with the warmth she had learned to let him see unguarded, and he felt it in the place where he kept everything important, which was deep and permanent and would be there. He was certain, in whatever came after all of this. He stayed in the doorway a moment longer. The children bent over the journal, heads together, Thomas pointing at something, Cecil already asking a question. The herb box on its shelf in the evening light. The garden beyond the windows, gone to its winter sleep but always coming back. He would fix the step in the morning. He had told himself he would fix it this week. But for now he stood in the door of the workroom that he had built for the woman who had made everything in his life larger and more real than it would have been without her, and let the moment be exactly what it was. Essential. Both of them. All of this. Exactly where they were supposed to be.